when I was initially covering this issue, I can sort of see like what was happening with it. Like, and we probably won't even just cover like TFUE FaZe type of stuff, but I think it's like a good place to start because it's in the title. And like my initial take was like, wow, I really think that FaZe has a super good chance of going down for this. And then I guess as like my knowledge of like law and like how it works evolved, I started to change that tune. And now I guess like we should outline the situation first, or maybe that's a good place to start. I should probably shut up and be like, what is like the situation? Just like not even without any like context, but what's like the overview of the situation as you see it right now?
So from TFUE's side, I think it's clear he wants to get out of his contract.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that he's brought it in California, and has also brought it before, I believe the Department of Labor has sort of a separate administrative action going.
Yeah.
And has invoked the Talent Agency Act, tells me that he just wants to get out of the contract. There are other things sort of buttressing that, but I thought it was very interesting because this is a rampant issue throughout esports. It's starting to get cleaned up, but esports players, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many, have long been misclassified as independent contractors instead of being treated as employees. And it's not what you call them, it's how you treat them and a number of factors that the courts look at to really consider that. And if you look at TFUE's claims, he doesn't bring up any misclassification issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting. And to me, that again spoke to the fact that he's not trying to recover unpaid wages. He's not necessarily saying or trying to go down the route of, oh, I was an employee, because if you're an employee, you run into other issues. It moves away from the principal agent relationship that you have with like an actor and their agent, and you can get away from those whole talent agency acts. Now, again, I'm not super familiar with those aspects. I've looked at them in some degree, but when I saw that the misclassification wasn't in there, that was my thought. He's trying to avoid the employment issue, and he's trying to go straight to the Talent Agency Act and trying to get this contract invalidated. That's also why he brought it in California, in my opinion.
Okay. So that's the TFUE side of it, right? Overview. Yeah.
Yeah. And then FaZe Clan, what's really interesting is they've sued in New York in federal court. And I noted that in TFUE's lawsuit, he says that he's a citizen, or he resides both in Florida and California. And it's a little ambiguous there because jurisdictionally, there's a principle that's called complete diversity. If two parties in a lawsuit, and it gets more complicated when you get more, but basically on the two sides of the V, the plaintiff on the top, the defendant on the bottom, if they're from completely different states and the amount at issue is more than $75,000, you can bring it in federal court. You can bring your lawsuit in federal court.
Okay.
And so TFUE brought his in state court in California. He said that he resided both in Florida and California. The principal place of business for FaZe is in California, so that keeps it out of federal court. It's a really interesting strategic decision too, especially now that you have FaZe Clan filing suit in the Southern District of New York. Now, even though FaZe Clan, I believe, is incorporated in Delaware, does its business in Los Angeles, TFUE has no connection to New York. The contract itself says that it's governed by New York law, and that any disputes under the contract have to be brought in New York.
Okay.
This gets really into the weeds, but I don't know why they originally chose that. I don't know why FaZe Clan chose that. I can tell you, though, getting into federal court and getting out of California could, if I'm right about TFUE's strategy to be in California to try to get the agreement invalidated, because California is very protective of labor.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have a story about this. Yeah.
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 And they're very protective of entertainers and people who would fall under the Talent Agency Act. Big industry there, obviously. So in New York, go ahead.
Well, what Ryan is talking about right now is there's been a long-standing thing in esports and talent in general, actually, and particularly in California, where most of esports is centered. Right, you've got Blizzard there, you've got the LCS there. Most competitions have a pretty big basis. What we're talking about is, for the longest time in esports, we would contract people, we would contract players as essentially independent contractors. And I say we as like an entire industry. Basically, everybody did this, and almost everybody still does this. But there is California is extremely protective of employees and the classification of employee, and the difference between an employee and a contractor is huge. Like I think a lot of this issue, Ryan, right? It's around exclusivity. The idea of can you say, hey, you can only play for my team, and then as a contractor, right? Like you that's like the exclusivity issue is like the big thing that we've wondered about. Do I have that right?
That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are multiple factors that go into it. The biggest one is kind of the control test. Who controls the means? Who controls your payment schedule, what you do on a day-to-day basis, what you use, the tools of your trade. So for example, if a team is telling you, you have to use the HyperX gear, you have to use this gaming chair, you have to use this keyboard, these peripherals, you have to practice on this schedule, you have to follow these rules, and we're going to pay you twice a month like an employee or something. It's moving towards an employment relationship as opposed to an independent contract relationship. These contracts, especially when I first came in the scene, they would sort of do these legal acrobatics to try to avoid being an employment relationship while also still having a lot of these control elements in there. And one of the things that drove me nuts was you would see these places where they would make the player represent and warrant that they were an employee. And I would be like, look, you can't, that's a legal determination. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to have my player represent a warrant in this roundabout way where like, okay, it turns out you're actually an employee, but we're having you represent a warrant that you're an independent contractor. And so now you have to pay us back or protect us from any legal fees or fines we get from the state. Like the team could try to do that. It was ridiculous. It was over the top. And also I saw one of the questions, somebody wanted to know about jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Jurisdiction is basically the court that, whether or not the court can bring somebody into its court to say, hey, you have to listen to us. So for example, if you're an individual and you're in New York and you never leave New York and you never do anything that could reach to another state, then like California could not get jurisdiction over you necessarily to drag you into California. Classic example is suppose you are driving cross country from New York to California, and in Nebraska you hit somebody with your car, or there's some action that arises, something that happens in Nebraska, then the court could say, hey, we can get jurisdiction over you. A lot of times they still have to serve process on you. That's kind of the way that you tell somebody that they're being sued. You still have to serve process on them when they're in Nebraska. A lot of businesses that do business all over the place, they'll have specific process servers. So like big national corporations, they'll be doing business all over the country. They'll have an individual process server in each state that can receive service for them. So very nerdy legal stuff, but basically what they're trying to do with state jurisdiction versus federal jurisdiction, in my opinion, is TFUE is trying to get this lawsuit in California state court where he's more likely to get a favorable result and get out of his contract, because I think that's really what he's trying to do. And FaZe Clan, I think at this point, part of it's publicity, part of it's trying to recover something if they're going to lose him anyway. And they're doing it in New York so that they can get away from the California issues, the more labor-friendly jurisdiction and the more talent agency conscious jurisdiction.
What I'm curious about with FaZe is so do you know about Lee Trink? Like who this guy is? No. Okay, so this surprised me a lot. Let's pull up this dude's LinkedIn. Because I wasn't taking FaZe seriously until I found out who their CEO was. Like FaZe to me seemed like sort of a kind of compilation of kids basically trying to run a team, and the way that they responded publicly to the initial like TFUE drama, particularly through a dude named FaZe Banks.
Yeah,
like
I
just,
saw that video.
Yeah, it just shows me that like they like the professionalism was off kilter, but the reality was that they actually do have a really heavy hitter who wasn't talking until later. This dude went to Brooklyn Law School and he practiced as was it a DA in New York, chat? Something like that. I'm gonna try to pull up his record. Anyway, this guy is assistant district attorney in Kings County. Yeah. So this dude is no joke, and has particularly has some connections in New York, and I suspect that might have been part of the motivation as to why. I don't really understand why FaZe is going after TFUE now. It seemed to me that like when I talked to most people that were kind of in the know about this situation, they said, sorry, I'm bringing a bunch of issues up at once. When TFUE, the TFUE versus FaZe situation, the initial contract didn't seem like it was going to go anywhere, probably settle out of court. But the Labor Commission thing seemed really interesting. I want to make sure that like we cover the implications of that. But yeah, this guy is a dude that's like worth looking at, and might have been some of the motivation for them to get to do this this New York thing.
Yeah, well, that also makes sense. If he's got a lot of connections there, I mean, honestly, especially if you practiced in a jurisdiction for a while, you're more likely to be familiar with the judges. You're more likely to be familiar with the other people who are going to be around. It's basically trying to move it to home turf where you think you're going to get a more favorable ruling and better understand the legal system you're facing. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so that was something that I thought was like really interesting. What do you think of like the sort of like division between, because there's really two separate issues going on here on the TFUE side, right? There's the actual lawsuit that's been filed with the courts in California, and we have like Bryce and like Ryan Morrison and like other people saying that that's probably not going to amount to a lot. I don't know what your opinion is on that. I was actually particularly interested in that because I thought initially what Bryan Freeman was doing was he was trying to get this issue of esports players being employees or not onto the center stage, and that's what he campaigned on, right? When he initially made his statements, Bryan Freeman, who's the lawyer who represents TFUE, he said that he was going to try to represent esports players everywhere and get them this sort of fair representation as employees. But it now seems like to me that his objective was more to kind of just try to get TFUE out of a contract. And then there's some difference there between that and the actual Labor Commission complaint, right?
Yeah, and I think that's right. So
okay.
This isn't brought as a class action complaint, and like I said, there's no real misclassification issue brought up in it. So I don't think he's going for it with that one. Just a side note as well, a lot of these big teams, I know that when the TFUE suit came out, a lot of lawyers started scrambling, trying to figure out, is this going to hurt our clients or is this going to benefit our clients? So on the player side, I'm sure Ryan Morrison and his team were looking heavily at how can we use this to our advantage. And I'm sure Bryce Blum and his team we're looking at, all right, what are all the ways we can argue that our people are not actually acting as agents and need to go register under the Talent Agency Act? Because there's actually a registry in California, and I will regularly go and check to see if major teams are registered because I've seen their contracts. Yeah,
nobody is. we never did that.
To his credit, Ryan Morrison's Evolve Talent Agency actually is registered.
That's cool.
Yeah, and a lot of people are operating in this space as managers instead of necessarily like agents. There's questions of whether or not they are actually acting as agents, but a lot of this is untread ground. So there aren't a lot of test cases yet. This is going to be one of those test cases, which is why it's really important. I still expect a settlement before there's a major decision out. I still expect these parties to eventually come to a settlement just because like an adverse ruling on one of these things could be really detrimental to a lot of teams, or could be detrimental to players depending on how it goes. So really, what was the other question you asked at the beginning? I'm sorry, I was going off on one track.
I'm trying to figure out like why. So my initial idea of the sort of like how FaZe was actually going to get in trouble for this was the Labor Commission part of it. because I felt like when the Labor Commission turned over, like my feeling on it is that they're basically a government entity that's like, what's esports? Because they probably don't know. They look at FaZe and they see underage kids drinking in a house, dudes making YouTube videos and falling over on skateboards and getting like bloodied. And then simultaneously, all those guys are contracted to an organization. One of them's 12, right? And literally 12. And then like they're all contracted to an organization. And every one of them is like basically treating these people as employees, paying them, right? And getting content off of them. And then the Labor Commission looks at that and goes like, what the hell is going on? And then they come in hard. That was my perception of it. Is that accurate? Is that right? Or like, what's going on with that?
So I think that is a concern, but I'll be honest, right now, I think the big issue that's distracting people from putting a bigger magnifying glass on esports is loot boxes. And there are a lot of lawsuits and legislation on the loot box issue. And I think that's where a lot of the regulatory gaze is focused. So it's not going to be focused as much on some of these other issues that I do think are really big potential issues. Now, esports is starting to clean up the misclassification issue with the advent of the big leagues. So League of Legends with LCS, Overwatch League, those are all employees. And I'm starting to see more people being treated as employees. At first, I'll say, a lot of teams, it felt like they were only moving because the leagues and publishers were forcing them to move. There are now some teams who are just doing it because they think it's the right thing to do. It's going to cost them some more money because you'll potentially end up with other things like benefits and unemployment insurance, things like that, Social Security, that it's going to have to get taken out.
Do you think that they're also concerned about liability? Because as a team, like I would, just speaking as a team owner, right? I would probably not, maybe this is just my own ethics, but I would probably not move until I was confident that I was going to go under for it. Just because the amount of cost associated with moving people to employees and the implications of it is so massive, right? It's very hard. It's a very big switch.
Yeah. So I think that there is a liability issue and some people are thinking about that. Yeah. But again, for a lot of teams, unless you're of a certain magnitude, like who's going to get the hammer first in North America, right? Like you're not going to get some small podunk esports team. Right. You're going to get like, the Cloud9s and the Team Liquids. FaZe, those are the ones that have to worry.
Yeah.
But they're already in LCS. They're in Overwatch League. And so they're already getting pushed in that direction naturally. So I think it's less a liability issue for them. I think it's just where they're getting pushed.
Got it. Okay.
Also, really interesting point. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but there are new contract provisions coming out where when players renew, they have to waive a lot of claims that might have accrued before. So I think that teams are also trying to deal with this in a way of like, we want to make sure that if that regulatory hammer ever does come, we try to do everything to protect ourselves against that liability. I don't know how successful that will be because even if, like a player waives their claim, like that doesn't do you any good against the government.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I will say I dabble in some employment law because of the nature of my work, but I am not like super focused, especially on California, like the Labor Commission. I saw one question come in and ask about like the Labor Commission complaint. I haven't dived into that, and I am not like a California employment lawyer, so I can't really opine on that more than I already have.
So for the Labor Commission, you see the focus on loot boxes is actually going to be sort of like a red herring to like that, because I never thought of that. Like I like, let's say there's like 100 units within the Labor Commission, right? Like I would like whereas like units is like resources. I would assume that like they could handle both, right? Like the one
different branches.
Yes.
So it won't be the Labor Commission looking at loot boxes,
right?
But I think what happens is just think about regular politics, right? Like our focus can only be on so many things at once. And the Labor Commission has a bunch of other issues beyond esports that they're dealing with.
For sure, yeah.
And it could get some scrutiny on it, but I don't know if it's going to get to that point. You also need sort of political pressure. You need public outcry to sort of really focus on an entire industry. And
I see.
where is that focus right now for video games and esports? It's on loot boxes. So I think like right now, the political will, the publicity, the public outcry from parents is on that. So it's not a labor commission issue. It's the wider, where is our communal gaze focused?
So are you saying that like political and like government entities like the Labor Commission generally respond quicker to like where the like outcry and pressure is? Is that like accurate?
I think that's generally true
Mm-hmm.
of most regulatory bodies. Is you'll have political priorities and you'll have agency priorities, but if you get a call from a higher up saying we're getting killed about this issue, I mean, like think about The Wire, right? Like
Yeah.
everybody, I think at this point has watched The Wire. Like you think about how the judge gets wind of, I can't even remember names right now. He gets wind of something from one of the cops, and then he starts putting pressure on other people, and they're like, "I'm getting hassled to go do this one thing," and start
Right.
investigating.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah,
And it's this
you still
chain.
get those
Yeah.
pressures.
Yeah. So I misjudged initially that I thought that like the kind of initial outcry from FaZe, which like was the biggest news for a few weeks, like would be that kind of pressure to get the Labor Commission to be like, hey, what? But apparently not. Like the issue is sort of contained within esports, and it's not like a like Ninja leaving Mixer or Ninja leaving Twitch type of like news, right? That kind of news and that kind of pressure was on like I had people
New York Times.
Yeah, like they were like there was like in bars they were like watching TV and like somebody's talking about it, right? Like that's crazy, right? But that didn't happen with this FaZe issue, did it? Like this issue got it kind of exploded, and then it kind of contained itself within like the esports sphere, and then that was it. And like because of that, it may be that the Labor Commission takes a while because they do need to. Esports is like a talked about issue, right? Like it's definitely on the docket, and I would think that within that are a lot of like legal implications as to like how people should be classified, how like if these guys are athletes, if they're not athletes legally, right? Like all that stuff should come into question, right? And that was my initial idea of like what is the case with this discussion.
Yeah, and I think that we as people in the industry tend to hyper focus on these things, but for the Labor Commission, it's a single complaint, right? Like it's a single complaint coming in. If they saw a rash of these, maybe all related to FaZe, then that might be interesting. I do think that if they really look at some of the issues with somebody under 12 signing a contract, I can tell you right now that that's a whole lot of mess. Regardless
I thought so
of how
too.
you slice it.
But why doesn't there's just not enough attention for them to turn their head?
I think they could look at that.
Or is it
but
time?
Again, I don't think they're going to go poking around necessarily an entire industry because of that. I think they might go poking into FaZe and saying, all right, what else is going on?
Thinking might happen, right? And so then so what I was thinking was that was the catalyst for them to look at FaZe. And then, so I got a bunch of blowback because people were like, well, like nothing's happened to FaZe yet. And what I told them was like, look, like these legal investigations take a hell of a long time, right? Like the Labor Commission is going to move super slow, but when they do move,
it depends.
Yeah. Okay. Does it? Yeah.
And it depends. And there's a whole like, some of what I deal with is like white collar litigation as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's this whole behind the scenes of like, once you catch wind of these things, negotiations with whoever's investigating, trying to come to like, all right, we're going to cooperate with this to some degree. We're going to help you along. And then trying to negotiate a settlement typically. So I expect practically all of this to settle in some way. I expect the lawsuits between TFUE and FaZe to ultimately settle in a very confidential settlement. I expect that the most likely outcome of any Labor Department investigation is that some sort of settlement comes up. FaZe, to my knowledge, probably doesn't have any history of violations. So they're like, all right, first time. I'm not going to speculate on what they're going to do exactly because I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing it's going to be some sort of settlement. I don't know if there will be liability or not, fine or not, but there'll be some component.
Settlement meaning like you owe us money or like what kind of thing?
Yeah, there could be penalties.
Yeah.
There could, yeah.
But these penalties don't include like labor commission is unlikely to like shut down. And I understand these are all degrees of what ifs, right? But like the labor commission is unlikely to shut down like FaZe, like they're actually to bring down FaZe as a result of like employing 12-year-olds and underage drinking and stuff, or is that an actual outcome?
I don't know.
Okay,
I'll say that on that one. I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how much they go like, whoa, all this crazy stuff going on. We are gonna just put the hammer on this. Don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you know if it's possible?
I'd have to look. I would guess so. Like, especially if I mean, I've dealt with cases where, you know, you have nuisance statutes dealing with like local businesses where they could put the business out if they wanted to. So I wouldn't be surprised if the labor commissioner for certain violations could just shut you down. I don't know if this rises to that level though.
Yeah, fair
and I'd
enough.
have to double check. Like I said, I'd have to go dig in and see like, all right, what is the full authority of the labor commission? And that's not my my particular area of expertise.
Yeah, for sure. Totally. Okay. So that makes sense to me. The issue around like FaZe suing TFUE, you said that this is like at least like kind of like partially publicity thing, but also like when I read the Verge article, it seemed, and like this is a guy reading a Verge article that's not a lawyer, so there we go. But they included the actual like submission in here, right? And it's like 9 separate accounts of TFUE. I guess they call them cause of actions, right? Everything from like breach of contract to confidentiality to disparagement to misappropriation of trade secrets to like international to all kinds of interference
intentional interference.
Yeah. So like what are the I mean that's serious, right?
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
When you get into litigation, there are some sides who they'll just deal with the lawsuit. They'll try to negotiate a settlement. There are other sides where they want to throw everything they can back at you. So they'll look for every counterclaim, even if you think it's absurd, and they'll throw it back at you and they'll find a way to frame it and to tell their story. Yeah. So I think part of this complaint is telling their story.
Got it.
And trying to like recover some of the harm that's been done to them just in the court of public opinion as well. Because a complaint is really an opportunity to tell your story, and it's a public document, so you can use it to do that work for you. The questions that I have when I look at all of these complaints is, what are your damages? Because one thing that people don't think about is like, all right, fine, let's suppose that you win on your tortious interference claim. Let's suppose that you win on your disparagement claim. Where are your damages? You have to show evidence of harm. And especially when it's sort of soft harm, it's hard. When there's a contract where it says, you build me a bridge and I pay you $10,000 and you don't build me a bridge, it's like, all right, well, my harm is going out and finding somebody who would build a bridge, and maybe the next best person I can find can only do it for 15,000. So my damages are 15,000.
Yeah.
Here now with disparagement clauses, if I remember correctly, they might have liquidated damages associated with it. I don't see them putting it directly in here, and I don't remember the contract right now. A lot of teams will put what are called liquidated damages clauses with those things that are hard to estimate, but you have to have a reasonable estimate of actual harm.
Right.
And if that's not in there, it's considered a penalty instead of liquidated damages, and courts often don't enforce them.
Got it. Yeah. And even if they do, the penalty is a maximum amount depending on the county, right?
Yeah.
And it's not usually that high. It's like a couple $100,000 or something. Yeah.
It depends. Like each, I've seen them be at a bunch of different levels. There's also a question of like proving disparagement is also really difficult, because if I'm saying something true about you, but it's negative, like, you punched me in the stomach, and it's true, you actually did punch me in the stomach. Like, is that disparaging you?
Right.
So a lot of these clauses, like, they start to run into First Amendment things. They start to run into other issues. And again, I think that a lot of that stuff is put in here to throw a bunch of stuff at the wall to tell their story. Because I'm looking at this again, and I'm not seeing any particular claims for damages. And I think that calculating a lot of this stuff would be really difficult. Like you just get, by reason of the foregoing, FaZe Clan has been damaged in the amount according to proof at trial, together with interest thereon at the legal rate. Like, to be proved at trial. We're going to tell you how much this has harmed us if we get that far, and I don't expect it to ever get that far.
That's funny. I wouldn't even seen that. That's cool. So they're not even like making a claim initially as to what they think they're owed.
Yeah, and that's pretty common, to be fair.
Okay.
Especially with these sort of squishier cases, unless you have like, you stole in fraud, you embezzled $200,000 from me. Unless you have something where you can really point at to a concrete amount off the bat, why do it? Go digging, do some discovery, dig up and see how much you really think there is. You're probably going to have to get an expert. Like I can't imagine this not settling just because I'm envisioning how much it would cost to get from here to trial with 2 lawsuits in 2 different jurisdictions and the briefing that's going to happen on motions. So when it's going to cost so much money.
So when it settled, a settlement meaning that TFUE meets with FaZe and then they both come to some kind of mutual agreement to get out of this at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So typically what happens is exactly like you said. Imagine you're coming together to do a business deal about your failed business deal. You're coming together like, all right, guys, we messed up. You messed up. Neither side is going to admit that. How much is it going to take to solve this? Like, one side paying the other. And so I think part of this as well is also FaZe Clan trying to get leverage for those settlement negotiations, saying, all right, we'll also waive our claims that we have now, but let's not pay each other anything. We'll just let you out of your contract. Or you pay us $120,000 and we'll let you out of your contract. Whatever. They could negotiate that, come to an agreement. Then they'll put it into a nice document and they'll have a bunch of provisions about if anybody ever breaks what they promise in the document, we're going to sue you for $1 billion. I mean, that is one case where I will tell you, if I'm not going to bet on it, but if I were to bet on it, there's going to be really careful confidentiality language in there, and that if anybody breaches that confidentiality, there are going to be some carefully calculated
in terms of the settlement.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Stormy Daniels. Think about Stormy Daniels, Donald Trump, right?
Right.
Like that was what the big fight was about. Was actually her breaching the confidentiality aspect of it.
Yeah, and this is because, well, this is even, I wouldn't say it was even bigger, but it's to the tune of basically everything's content, right? So if they reach a settlement and then TFUE comes out or FaZe comes out and makes a 2-minute video that's like, let me tell you the story and why this is fucked up, right? Like, then that immediately,
oh my gosh,
yeah, it just starts another
it's causing me pain, like physical pain right now, just to think about that. Like when Banks came out with his video, I was like, if I were his lawyer, I would be withdrawing from the case right now. I would be like, I can't.
Well, that's what I felt was like so like he comes out and he says like he literally said my employees are shit. Right? Like, I can't even remember like all the stuff he said. Oh my God. Like
it was a bad contract.
Yeah. And I was like, so that was why I looked at the issue and I was like, how can this not go badly for FaZe, right? Because all that stuff can show up in discovery later. And that's all leverage that Brian and TFUE's side can use against FaZe in this settlement negotiation, right? Like that's going to cost FaZe physical money.
Well, here's what will happen.
Yeah.
If this gets to discovery, which is where you can start requesting documents, you can start doing getting sworn testimony from different people involved. If I'm TFUE's lawyer, I'm sitting down with Banks and I'm going to have that video teed up. I'm going to hit play and I'm going to hit pause after every single sentence and say, what did you mean by that? Who else did you talk to about this? What did you mean by it was a crappy contract or whatever he said? Let's really dive into that. Because you put all of this stuff out there in the public and it's just like, oh, this is juicy discovery material.
Yeah, exactly. And so that, like in the settlement negotiations, like, I mean, the lawyers on TFUE's side have got to be like, look, we've got this stuff. Like, you guys are crazy, right? Like, this is going to be more money for us. You got to get set out of our contract. You got to get whatever we want out of this, right? Like, that's got to be a factor, right? Like,
well, this is the really difficult part. So settlement negotiations, again, one of the hardest things, lawyers were trained to do this. Getting your client on board is much more difficult, is you try to help them remove the emotion from the situation and get to, all right, you're a business person. Think about how you would handle this as a business deal, because
Got it.
a lot of these we describe as business divorces because they have that level of messiness where
Yeah, it's fair.
it's
Yeah.
like, yeah,
And this is-
husband and wife splitting up.
And this is even
Yeah.
more complicated, right? Because this is public. So it's like most divorces are not like talked about on Twitter with like 1,000 retweets or like have like a million views on YouTube. Yes, this is even more of that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally agree. So what the big challenge, I wouldn't go in there swinging like, we got this video, you guys are so screwed. You can't go in with that. What you got to go in with is like, all right, what do we need to do to fix this? And one side is going to have to step up and say, here's our initial offer. And then the other side is going to come back with a counter. There might be some reasons. I would expect them to start with mediation, where they have a neutral third party who's sort of helping to grease the wheels between the two sides.
Yeah.
And then, maybe that'll work, maybe that doesn't. But I would expect this to settle at a minimum before trial. And I would expect this to settle even before we got to like motions for summary judgment. Maybe do a little discovery, see like, all right, what really bad emails can we get? What really bad deposition testimony can we get out? And then, all right, now that we've got all the cards on the table, let's talk about settling this.
And you also think that what you'd be, like, you're guessing that the settlement itself actually doesn't become public knowledge. Like this isn't going to be in a YouTube video.
Oh, yeah.
Like, wow, that's kind of like, so the
I expect this. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. So
it'll be confidential.
So like the whole idea of like this becoming like the drama of this is going to fade up and like fade out or like basically, right? Like that's kind of where it's going. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's what I would expect. You see, I mean, most cases that's what happens. Even with like high profile business cases that aren't even celebrity cases, that's a lot of time what happens is you just get a confidential settlement agreement. The parties go their own ways.
And
maybe
people
they're suing
forget
each other
about
again over something else. Yeah.
And people forget about it.
Life goes on.
Yeah. And ultimately for TFUE, that's basically to get out of his contract. I mean, I mean, whatever he wants to do, like FaZe says he wants to start another esports organization, like who really knows? But like that's TFUE getting out of his contract, and FaZe not losing too much face over it. I think one thing we should try to do, both of us should try to do, is we should try as much as possible to simplify this issue. I would say distill this issue down into like what people can realistically expect. And the reason I say that is because like you and I can go back and forth on like I can do the business side and you can do the law side. And that's going to be a sort of like highbrow conversation that's going to be mostly inaccessible and not relevant to like the vast majority of people who are like attached in some way as fans to like either one of these sides and really know like what is going to happen to my favorite player, what is going to happen to my favorite team, and what is going to happen to like this thing that I like gaming and esports as a whole. And I think if we focus a little bit on that in the next like little while, it's going to be really productive for them. That's the intro. Then you were like, okay, well,
all right, no, it's me. I'm on. All right.
Okay.
Okay, so here's my guess from, and again, this is a guess. This is what I would expect to happen.
Mm-hmm.
TFUE is not going to keep playing for FaZe. He's going to go off. I would, if I had to bet, I would bet that he signs with an agency and starts doing the solo personality thing. You see that with a lot of the top streamers now. Shroud's not on a team anymore. Ninja might still be on Luminosity. I'm not totally sure. Lupo has been on Rogue. There are some streamers who are still associated with those teams, but by and large, they're their own independent personalities now, and they just market off of that.
They're also
they have their Twitch income
importantly represented by agencies, right? So like for example, Shroud is with Loaded and like things like that. Yeah. So like instead of being on esports teams, they're represented by like people like me, like Nerd Fusion talent, like organizations. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And so that's my guess for TFUE. He eventually gets out of his contract. I'm guessing that this settlement, what FaZe is trying to do is to get TFUE to pay them some amount to get out of his contract, and they'll do that in the form of a settlement. Mm-hmm. The Labor Commission side, if FaZe is really smart, I would expect them to try to settle this before the Labor Commission comes up with a decision about whether or not TFUE's contract is valid or not.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the Labor Commission gets around and says this contract's invalid, they lose so much leverage.
Why is that?
And also, well, because you already have the Labor Commission
Mm-hmm.
saying that, and then I would take that decision from the Labor Commissioner, take that up to the court and say, hey, we've got this administrative ruling that helps you to argue that this contract is invalid. And that also helps you to fight against the New York lawsuit. You can go to New York and say, hey, we've already got this ruling. Part of why they're in New York is to try to get away from jurisdictions like the California Labor Commissioner telling them what to do. But
right.
Again, getting into the nerdy legal stuff, we don't have to do that anymore. I think there's some reasons that the Southern District of New York will say, we're going to wait until the California lawsuit's done. So with FaZe, I think that if the Labor Commissioner continues to look into the, hey, you had an 11-year-old kid sign a contract, what's going on? I would expect that they probably have some sort of settlement with the Labor Commission, and then they keep on trucking. And then they also deal with, the FaZe apparel lawsuit that they've got. I don't know if that's settled yet or not.
And there's isn't there that one where like there was like a raid that was like sounded like some Shadowrun thing, like where there's like a raid on like a. Did you read about this?
No.
There was like a raid on like a FaZe facility or something, and like a bunch of stuff was stolen. It's like this, and there's like this huge like thing about it. Chat might be able to expand on it. Some weird stuff, but yeah, stuff like this, right? So with FaZe, the Labor Commission keeps pushing some settlement here, and we don't really know the extent of that, right?
Yeah. So I bet there will be, if the Labor Commission digs in to those other issues beyond the scope of the complaint, then I would expect a settlement. Otherwise, I expect FaZe to somehow settle this with TFUE before the Labor Commission comes out with a decision.
Would that stop the Labor Commission's investigation? It wouldn't, right?
I'm not entirely sure. I think they probably have independent authority to just investigate themselves. So it might be persuasive for them, especially if you say, I'm going to shut down this complaint and I'm not going to, cooperate with it anymore.
Yeah.
Like we've resolved this. But I don't know the full scope of their authority. Like I said, I'm not a California Labor Commissioner guy. That's not something I do a lot or much at all. So, that's beyond my purview. But I would expect TFUE gets out of his contract, goes and signs with an agency, becomes an independent superstar. FaZe eventually has possibly a settlement with TFUE, probably a settlement with TFUE, possibly a settlement with the Labor Commission, and then keeps on trucking. Esports overall, I expect a lot of teams to have gotten really scared and to have changed some practices, and otherwise the industry keeps on going, honestly. I don't think this will have as much of an impact on... I mean, I remember Ryan Morrison coming out, guns blazing, saying this is going to fundamentally change everything. I do think that there have been contract renegotiations. I think that Fortnite players have grabbed a lot more share, and I think it's empowered a lot of players to think about those things. And so I do think it's had a big impact on that front. But I think once this all settles down, I think the industry is just going to keep going along.
You don't think there's kind of a fork in the road where, I guess like what Brian, so like let's center around. I think this is really important and relevant. When Brian initially, when I refer to Brian, I'm referring to Brian Friedman, the person who's representing TFUE. When he originally brought the case to the California courts, it was under the auspice that players are being treated unfairly, and that he wants to run a sort of campaign to, and by the way, he's right. There are and this is one of the reasons you do what you do, right? Is like you represent players and you represent teams. Or do you represent teams or just players?
I represent largely players. I do work with a couple of teams.
Okay, so largely players.
With a lot of that,
yeah.
And with a lot of that, I tell them, look, I work with a lot of players, so if there's ever a conflict, I typically do not work on player contracts, with only a couple of exceptions on the team side.
Oh, really? So when you say you work with players, what are you referring to then?
Oh, no. I work with players on their contracts.
Oh, okay.
When it comes to teams, I'm usually working on like their intellectual property issues.
Okay. Yeah. So you're not working against team contracts for players. Yeah. So you like one of the reasons why I get people. I don't know. Have you gotten anybody yet that's come to you from me?
I don't think so.
I think so far I've referred 3 people, but I don't know if they've actually. Okay, so like,
Oh, they might. Maybe they didn't name drop.
yeah, like what usually happens is, just to give chat some context here. The reason why I really took this on, and I did a lot of I did more content about this issue than I think I do about like any one issue. I would say like 6 videos and like a lot of hours spent on it. And the reason was because I do think that one of the most important issues in esports is that players are widely being treated unfairly. And more importantly, I see this as a continuing issue because they're so young. And when you are like, even if you're 18 to 25, let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they're even above 18, right? You get into a business negotiation with like some hard-hitting people that do this every day. And it's like the first time that I tried to sell a company, I think about it, right? Like, and I didn't really know how M&A went. I got rolled under the table because that's all these guys do. And so it's like the same thing happens with, and like when I see TFUE sign a contract like this, and to be, I don't know about, we haven't actually gotten into, I'm really curious about your opinion on this. My personal position was that like from having reviewed dozens and dozens of esports contracts, the contract the initial contract that TFUE got was insane. Like some people were saying like, oh, it's a starter contract. And like, no, I have never seen a contract in my life that took 80% of basically like any brand deal, starter contract or not. That's like ridiculous. Yeah. And like, I don't know what, maybe we should, before we go on, we should get your take on that. Like, I don't know. Like,
so the 2 things that stood out to me as particularly egregious on that contract was the prize pool split and the sponsorship splits.
Yeah.
Beyond that, like at first there was a lot of big outrage, and then I looked at the contract. I was like, some of this is kind of in line with what I expect. Like there are some things that I would argue and try to clean up and everything. And I would have pushed back if I were representing him. But the 2 things that really stood out were that prize pool split and the sponsorship splits.
Maybe I'm a goody two shoes dude, but like when I wrote contracts with Dig and CLG, I didn't have anywhere close to that shit, and I was signing people that were a lot less relevant than TFUE was at that time. TFUE, when he when he signed that contract, he had like 400 to 700 concurrent viewers. He wasn't nobody. And like, yeah. I was signing nobodies to way, and I'm not flexing here, but like seriously, I was signing nobodies to way fairer conditions than that. Like I would never ever go above like a 10% split on sponsorship rev, right? Like I would never do that. Like there, like the merch stuff, there was so many issues in there. So like when I saw that, I was like, okay, like this is an example of a player being treated unfairly, like a player. And look, like what that comes down to, by the way, for everybody that's watching, and like if you have anybody you know in esports, and you have anybody that is a player and is considering getting in at a serious level, fucking email me, malixiatv@gmail.com. It's in the Discord. It's everywhere. And like, tell me, like, I need to get in front of somebody, get representation. It doesn't cost as much as you think. I will put you in front of Ryan. Like, we will make that first 3 introduction. It is absolutely necessary so you don't like get in a situation like TFUE doesn't want to be in the situation. It sucks. Legal stuff sucks. No offense. Like it, like no, like Ryan, like
no, it does.
Yeah. He's just like, yeah, it does.
Who wants to do this?
Yeah, like it's like it's fun for Ryan on his side, but like you don't want to be involved in some like long litigation or things like that. Like it's just rough. So I think like going back to the FaZe TFUE thing, like to me it seemed like when Brian Friedman initially like went out into the public, he was like, I'm fighting for players everywhere. And I was like, yes, this is going to be the time when California turns its head and goes, you know what? These are unfair practices. We need to regulate this in some way. Now that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be more of like a personal thing of TFUE trying to get out of a contract. Maybe that was it just lip service? Like what happened there?
I don't know. I think that behind the scenes, they could be looking at a class action. I mean, it's certainly something that I thought could come, and I think it could be industry wrecking in some ways because so many people have been misclassified at every level that the amount of money involved that could come up would, I mean, it could be huge. So I think there is still the potential for a class action. I wouldn't be surprised if they're still thinking about it. I don't know. I've never talked to them.
Yeah.
So
I'm really interested in that issue. Yeah, okay, so that could be. So a class action lawsuit's not out of the question, of course, but we don't really know.
Class actions are you have to, the main issue in a class action lawsuit, like in most lawsuits, you file a lawsuit, then you deal with like motions to dismiss, you deal with motions for summary judgment, and then you go to trial if you kind of get past those stages.
Yeah.
With class actions, there's an extra step called class certification, where you have to show to the court that the like there's a bunch of different factors. The commonality of legal and factual questions are close enough to everybody in the class that it's got to be reasonably manageable. You have to, like, the class representatives have to fairly represent the class. There's all these showings you have to do. And essentially what happens with class action lawsuits typically is if the plaintiff side gets class certification, that is the big thing you have to win. And once you do that, because the defendants are looking at such a potential payday that they're just going to get hammered on, that they look to settle it. One problem I do think with the class action lawsuits is you're going to have so many different teams you're dealing with and enough different publishers that I think getting that commonality is a little difficult.
Okay.
I don't think it's insurmountable, but I do think there are challenges inherent with a class action lawsuit in the space. I don't think it's a slam dunk.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So a class action lawsuit would go against whom exactly? It would be.
That's actually the question.
Yeah, it really is, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's really the players saying we want maybe a list of demands to be treated fairly, to be considered along these ways. To maybe one example would be all players should have. Is this a possibility? Like, all players should have the ability, or like the requirement even, to have like legal representation, right? Like could that be? Is that a possibility? And then, like, if that's the case, who's it against? Is it against Cloud9? Is it against Riot Games? Like how does it work? Yeah, that's like a really weird thing.
Oh yeah, and I would have to put so much more thought into that to really think it through.
Yeah.
The demands you would make, again, like, who are you enforcing this against? Because if you want injunctive relief, which is where instead of asking for money, you ask the court to tell the other side to do something.
Yeah.
Like, who would you do that against? So who do you force to say, yeah, you have to tell the player to go get a lawyer? And frankly, if there's a team out there who says, no, don't go talk to a lawyer, like, just run. Just run away from that team. If they're actively deterring you from trying to get a lawyer.
Absolutely.
Like, maybe they don't tell you actively, like, yeah, go talk to a lawyer about this. But a lot of teams are really trying to do that now. At least good teams, they're saying, hey, you should talk to a lawyer or at least get an agent or something like that, and encouraging players to do that. That actually, the agency and the lawyer difference is a really interesting thing. And Ryan Morrison and I have some disagreements on that front, but he's also got a talent agency and I don't. So there's some divides on whether or not you should have an agent in the space or not. Yeah. I do think there are some spaces where it's valuable. I think there are some where you're better off just getting a lawyer to help you. And honestly, the person I tell players to start with and streamers to start with, get an accountant first. And then ask them questions until they're like, you need to ask a lawyer that. And then at that point, get a lawyer.
Yeah, I think that's fair, because probably the number one issue is like people managing their money, which I mean, the literal extent of like 90% of streamers that I've ever talked to, and esports players actually, it's like, what are you doing with your money? And I ask them, and they're like, well, I'm just throwing it in a checking account. And I'm like, okay, dude, and I had to, for CLG, I hired a finance dude to come in, and like a third party from a company, to come in and talk to players about it, because it was such an issue.
That's so good. That's so good of you. I'm so proud.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. It's just like, I mean, I actually care about players, so I'm one of the few, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, sure. Another thing as well, like, I do think that you want to start with an accountant and a lawyer. If you're a big independent personality, I think getting an agent is vital. And then there are certain esports spaces where I think agents work much better than others. Like, I don't have any Overwatch clients, and Ryan knows that, Barry Lee over at Evolve knows that market inside and out.
Yeah.
And so he knows what pretty much everybody's making. He knows where there are certain fits. He's just studied up on that space. Whereas like Dota 2, like, if you need legal representation in Dota 2, like, that's my main thing.
Yeah.
Dota 2, Counter-Strike. Yeah. Counter-Strike is something else I've worked a lot in. FGC, other things like that. So, but yeah, Overwatch I think is really a space where, because they have so much market knowledge, getting an agent there isn't a bad idea.
Yeah, for sure. And funny enough, like there's a lot of places where agents could be relevant, like and kind of work in tandem with like lawyers and accountants and everything like that. Like I think the perception from a lot of people that are esports players is like, it's really expensive to get a lawyer, right? And that's something what's that?
Well, depending on your deal, it's going to be cheaper to get a lawyer than it is an agent, because if an agent is taking
20% of
your
it,
deal,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Let's say that they're taking just 10% of your deal, and you're getting like $120,000 contract or something. Like you're playing League of Legends, you're looking at, let's just say 100,000 just to make the math easy.
Yes.
If your agent gets a cut of that and they're getting 10%, they're getting 10,000. I can tell you that I have never hit that amount of billing for like helping a player to negotiate a contract. Like,
yeah, but
never.
Even so, I know Ryan Morrison does this, so I'm curious, like, and I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit because you're probably gonna have to. Yeah. But I know, like, if a player from like Overwatch who has like 10 followers messages Ryan, like Ryan has some way of helping them out without like costing them like $500 an hour, and engages them, and there's some relationship there that happens that leads to like better, like more fruition like later. I wonder if you have a system like that. Basically, what I would say is like, if I'm a player, I have 1,000 followers, my paycheck is $2,000 a month. Okay, like I actually need representation as much as TFUE does, but I have like, if I'm gonna pay a third of my income for the month to like a lawyer to figure that out, that's like not sustainable. And really, it's the teams that should pay that cost. But yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So this is a really tough issue in the space, and I'm trying to work on efforts to help solve this by setting up a pro bono program where if your contract is under a certain amount, then we'll hopefully be able to find a lawyer who will help you do this as pro bono work. And the benefit to the lawyer is they'll get experience in the space. So that's still in process, and there's still a lot of things that need to get set up. And I'm also trying to do it like, in the few hours of free time that I don't really have. So that's taking a lot of time. But that is something I'm trying to work on. What I do occasionally help people pro bono, and especially in certain dire circumstances, I've helped people pro bono or on reduced rates. And it's really tough because like I'm also trying to build this practice where, Ryan's got a bunch of clients at this point in the esports space, whereas I divide my time about 30% esports and 70%, big litigation cases and other things like that. I'm still trying to build it up. I try to do what I can to help, and then, I'm trying to build other systems on top of that. Typically, what I will do is if somebody has some just basic questions, and I'll just chat with them. Like my DMs are open on Twitter. People message me all the time, and they're just like kind of asking basic questions. And if it gets to a point where I'm like, look, at this point we got to talk about an engagement versus just some friendly advice, then I'll let them know. Yeah. And I'm very upfront about like what my rates are. I don't know that I want to broadcast them like to everybody, but like if you ask me on Twitter and DMs or you shoot me an email, I'll tell you.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, because I think that's like one of the, like, those players getting representation, understanding why that's important versus like how it's realistic for them to do so is really important. And I think that's what screwed up TFUE in the first place, right? Like TFUE probably didn't see it as a realistic avenue to get a lawyer to represent himself with this, because this would never have happened if it did. Like this would have been, these contract issues and negotiation stuff would have been I mean kind of like cleared up at the on the groundwork, and it just would have been so much cleaner of a process. And like this is like. Unfortunately, I when I first looked at this issue with TFUEs and FaZe, and I was like, man, this is just not the last time this is going to happen. I
will say this.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. On the like price question, the vast majority of just straight contract reviews, where I'll review your contract, I'll write up a bunch of things for you to look at. You can ask me questions. By and large, those are less than $500. Yep. Which is still a lot if you're on a contract that's like $2,000 a month. But here's the thing, right? Here's the thing you could do. Sorry to interrupt, but like this is really important, right? If you're a player, hey, you want me to play for you, right? Will you pay my legal fees to get this contract reviewed? Super reasonable question to a team. I would always say yes as a team owner, because I want that player playing on my team. That's why I approach them, right? Like, if that player wants
like okay, if we're talking about like I don't even know like the total net amount of that deal, right? Versus in the long term versus the legal fees of getting that deal done. 100% of the time you help out, right? Because like because like why wouldn't I pay
that
the
makes
$500?
sense. I like that.
Yeah, me too. I just thought of it. Yeah, but I think it's good. I think like as a player, that's your leverage point.
I'd never thought of that before, but yeah, the one thing I will say from the legal side is if somebody else is paying the legal fees, and maybe you just get it as a signing bonus or something, right? You get like, all right, just guys, give me a signing bonus, but then there's tax issues that come up in that too. If the team were actually paying me directly, that gets a little weird.
Does it?
So you would, to do the review for a player, because then it's not a direct conflict of interest.
Mhm.
It's like typically what you end up having happen is there's a third party, like a parent, paying for their child's legal services, like their 18-year-old. Let's just put 18-year-old just not to get weird. You have a parent paying for the 18-year-old's legal services. I still have to tell the parent, like, look, you do not control the representation.
Right.
So
yeah.
if the team is paying me directly, which I've never had happen for a player's legal representation, you would get into some weird like.
I mean, I think that that's interesting to know, but I think it's like easily solvable. You just give like an extra $500 to the player or whatever. Yeah. It's like
they pay the player. Yeah.
Yep.
That's how I think you solve it.
Yeah. So that like going back to like TFUE FaZe, like that, if that had happened, we would be in a way better place. I also want your opinion on like it in general, the way that this case initially unfolded. We talked a little bit about it. Like, do you think professionalism matters on the side of FaZe? And like what do you think the implications of like how FaZe responded to this, especially initially, are on like the industry, if any?
That is a big, in some ways, loaded question because to me, like, I think professionalism is vital, and I think that,
me too,
as you said early on, like this industry in many ways is like run by a bunch of kids who've grown up with it, right? Like they're just starting to be more adults in the room, or people who've been running it are now actually adults. And
well, they look like adults. I don't know if they're not certain they're acting like them, but yeah.
Yeah. So personally, like I said at the beginning, if Banks had done, if he had put that video out and I had been his lawyer, I would have been pulling my hair out. I would have no hair right now. I'd be bald.
Yeah, it'd be
because
insane.
of how stressed out I would be.
Yeah.
So in that way, I mean, it drove me nuts. But at the same time, teams. Also, when it comes down to it, you talked about branding early on.
Yeah.
Like teams really have to think about what their brand is. And FaZe has a definite brand, and I don't think anything that Banks did was off brand.
Oh, definitely not.
Is it, Is it going to hurt them on the business front? Probably not. Mm-hmm. In fact, probably helped them.
Maybe it's a net positive.
Some of the reason they might be punching back is because they want to keep that brand going of like, no, we fight everybody. We're going to punch you in the nose.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised by it. The professionalism aspect, I do want more professionalism in the space. But I will also say, even people who act professionally can still stab you in the back. So, it's not just enough to have professionalism. I want good people in the space. That's my goal. Not just professionalism.
So how do you?
I want good people.
How do you do that? Like, what's that mean to you?
Like you were talking about how you were on the team side, but you cared about your players. That's the kind of person I want. I want people who are working for the best outcomes for the space overall. People ask me about monetizing the space. When will it happen? Things like that. I say it's anywhere between 5 years and never, because you either need copyright law to fundamentally change, or you need some publishers who act as benevolent dictators. We need more people on all sides, player side, team side, competition organizer side, broadcasters, everything, who are going to be good people and help to build a space. One of the best quotes I heard at one point was from, I just blanked on his name. But the quote was, we should figure out how to make a lot more money for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Not just teams, not just players, everybody.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what I mean. Like we should be watching out for everybody. Like we want people who are going to
Man, it's so
help
interesting
to make this space better.
It's so interesting you say that, because I think the way that if it's an issue of money, the way to make money is actually through professionalism, because that's what's going to get the ad dollars here. I'm telling you, man,
brands can trust you.
Yes, whenever FaZe comes out with like as memey as it is, and it pulls in the audience of like the kids and everything, and everyone goes, yeah, and like when this kind of situation goes down, it makes us look like clowns to the rest of the like serious F500s that are spending $500 million a year on advertising, right? Like if we want those dollars, we need to have professionalism. And I think that is like, that was my initial criticism of how FaZe responded to something like this, where it's like, this is like a serious legal proceeding, dude. You can't just go out and, or you shouldn't just go out and just say like, oh, my contracts are bad, my employees are bad, like TFUE, you're stabbing me. Like this like making this like a drama narrative, I think just shows to like major brands that we're not ready to be taken seriously yet.
Yeah. And I mean, maybe there are some brands that like that.
They're not brands that spend a lot
probably
of money.
a bunch.
Yeah, but they are. But
fair.
Sure, there are. Yeah, I mean, there's brands that like to advertise on Pornhub.
Yeah,
they don't pay the dollars. Yeah.
Quote, by the way, was Toby Sherman. It was Toby Sherman who said, "Let's figure out how to make everybody a lot more money." I think you're right in a lot of respects. I also think that you're starting to see this in. Yeah.
What's he doing?
You're starting to see this. He, last I heard, was working on developing a game.
CEO of Foundry IV, new sports platform, co-creator of E-League on TBS. He did that before.
Does he still have new sports on there?
Yeah.
He does have new sports on there, doesn't he? Yeah.
Yeah.
He was the. Anyway, yeah. So I think that's what he's still working on. Like, I still think there are other ways to make money in the space. I do think that advertising, it is a marketing space. It is an entertainment product, and any entertainment product is really banking on sponsorship dollars coming in.
Yeah.
But you are starting to see other directions come in. You're starting to see 100 Thieves become a lifestyle brand.
Yes.
You're starting to see like TSM is hiring
amazing.
engineers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although there is the question of, if your main selling point is that you're a lifestyle brand, like why are you doing your core business around an esports team at the same time? I think there are pros and cons to that.
Yeah. I mean, like overall, I almost see it as like Supreme could have an esports team because it's cool.
Yeah.
And like FaZe has an esports team because that's more true to the sort of narrative that Nadeshot started with. They don't need an esports team, but they've certainly figured out how the monetization model works outside of like just advertising and sponsorships in the typical way that esports teams make money. And they've done it really well. And I made a whole video on like how I thought that like 100 Thieves is basically killing it in terms of like what they're doing.
Yeah. No, I agree too.
Yeah.
I think 100 Thieves, if anybody, has impressed me the most with what they've done and the amount of time they've done it in.
Yeah, I mean, like, consider like versus if you look at like everybody else that's in the LCS, and then like you compare it to like the other teams that have had like a significant investment, and then you look at their brand quality, like they've just been doing great. And like to FaZe's credit too, FaZe does have they sell a ton of apparel. You saw the New York thing they did where they basically shut down.
Oh, the pop-up? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that was insane. Like the police basically shut it down because there were so many people there. Like this is FaZe is by no means like a joke of a brand. Like I would call the way that the way they act is a joke. But like as an organization, they're serious. They're serious players. And like that is actually, it's like issues like this that like when I think about TFUE and FaZe, it's like, man, if FaZe people are gonna look to FaZe and not like Golden Guardians, right? As like one of the faces of esports and how they respond to things. So like when like someone like Banks like comes out, and it wasn't just him, it was like a lot of FaZe people would come out and they do this like huge like unprofessional narrative. I do think it just kind of like reflects back on the industry. It ends up costing us a lot of dollars and kind of like gets us further away from Tobias's dream of like everybody getting paid, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. At the same time,
no, I think that's fair.
Yeah. At the same time, it does bring these kind of issues to light. And I guess I hoped from this that the issue of players being treated unfairly in contracts was going to see some light. And I guess I'm just like disappointed that it kind of looks like it just turned into a glorified contract negotiation.
Yeah. No, I think that's what that's a really good way to sum it up. That's what I think it will come down to, is a glorified contract negotiation, a very public, messy, litigation-based contract negotiation.
Well, that sucks. because like what's happening is that's standing aside all of the issues that I kind of like wish got brought to the fore from this. So like at the end of the day, it's like everybody stood up and then sat down again. And it's just like, oh, it's TFUE versus FaZe, and it ends up 2 lawyers and a third party sit in a room and decide who gets some money and what happens. And at the end, like you said, overall esports continues. What we should be talking about on this call that I think like is the issue for public discourse. How do we get to a world where players start get represented more fairly and esports starts to move forward out of this kind of like Wild West like hole that it's in that's resulting in like very few companies taking it seriously?
I think the biggest thing is players associations, honestly.
Really?
That's the first conversation I had when I got into this space. It's something I'm still talking about. I think the CSPPA is doing really good work, and I'm excited to see that continue to develop. I think publishers pay a lot more heed to, especially Valve, is a lot more heed to players and also to people who will help provide solutions to problems that they're not working on, so that they don't have to worry about it. And I honestly think that the most potential for seeing a good model is in the Valve space, especially if players associations have the traction I hope that they'll have. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Riot and Activision Blizzard. They're sort of having efforts at players associations, but those are in a very different dynamic.
Yeah.
But I also think as time goes on, I think we'll get more adults in the space, both in terms of people who've aged with esports and who've thought about these issues and who can help the younger generations to think more critically about them as well. I also think, just to go back to the TFUE FaZe thing, I do think there is one other major impact, and we talked about this a little bit, but there was a lot of renegotiations that happened after that, and I think it showed a lot of players like, look, you should be thinking about your contracts. And so I do think it was a flashpoint for those things.
That's a really good point. So you think that a lot of players, especially in like the maybe younger like Fortnite scene that maybe had no access or no knowledge of this before, were like, oh, maybe I should think about my contracts.
Yes.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's great. Yeah. And so that was a net positive of this issue. And continues to be as this issue like kind of goes back and forth. Like I actually think now this is the very first thought I've had on this, but like seeing that FaZe sued TFUE might even be 2x that, right? Because like now it's like, oh man, an esports organization can sue me if I don't have my stuff.
I've really got to think about this.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Like maybe like players like think about that and they're like, oh man, if an esports organization can sue me, like I need to be aware of that. So maybe that brings some awareness to players. Like, okay, like I need to like defend myself.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, I saw it happen in Overwatch. Like to Ryan Morrison's credit, initially when we got into Overwatch, which was pretty early, this is way before OWL and everything. Nobody was asking me for representation, right? I had a rule that any player that ever worked with me will defend. I would always say, here is my list of people that are not associated with me, and you can choose from them. They will represent you. That's how we're going to do this contract, right? I'm not going to give you a contract that is just like, here's what it is. Like, this is how it's going to work. And, we don't do this negotiation unless you have representation. So, I would, but, before that conversation happened, I could get an idea of if the player was going to bring it up or not. Right. So like if a player came in and said, hey, like, I would feel comfortable with a lawyer in this conversation, right? Like, or like in this negotiation. The times that was happening in like pre-OWL, like like Ryan getting into the space and representing a lot of people, it was like almost non-existent. And then like a couple years later, like every Overwatch player was telling me like, hey, like I want to get representation for this. Not necessarily Ryan, but like somebody, right? And that was great. Like that was like really good. So I do think I do think it's evolving. I've had a lot of like of the it's funny enough that now that we're talking about this, I've actually had a lot of like of the like younger kids message me on Twitter and DM me and be like, hey, like can I get, that was those 3 referrals I was referring to. Like it was all the same. It was all 2 of them were Fortnite and one of them was some like what was it, Rainbow Six? Yeah, Rainbow Six. And like they were all like, hey, like I never thought about this. Like who can I talk to? And that's great. Like, that kind of like attention is coming out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it'll get better over time.
Yeah, I think so too. So maybe that's the one kind of like that positive that came out of the TFUE FaZe situation. Do you think anything else will happen? I guess a class action lawsuit, but it's like probably a pretty remote possibility.
Yeah, and yeah. I don't know if that'll stem directly out of this. I think that's something that people have been thinking about for
a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Esports long.
Esports long. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not geologically long. Like not like 50 years.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. 30 minutes.
Yeah. Not Mount St. Helens long. Yeah. Yeah. Got it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Like.
So,
what other positives do you think? Like.
I really think that players becoming more aware of their rights and thinking about that is going to be the biggest thing. Okay. Honestly, beyond that, like lawyers are pessimistic by nature. I don't think there's going to be much more than that.
Okay. You live longer if you're an optimist. You hear that, right?
Oh, really? All right. Well,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, on average.
Outside of work, I'm an optimist.
There you go. Yeah, you just put on the pessimist hat for the work.
Yeah, for the job.
Yeah, there you go. We covered this a little bit, but we should just do a brief summary. Why is the lawsuit being filed in New York other than California? In regards
to
this is just because I think this is really an important part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are a couple reasons they're trying to do it there. If I were to speculate. Yeah. And one is they want to get away from California, which they probably think is a less friendly jurisdiction for them. 2, in the contract, it was one of the things where when I saw this contract, it kind of blew my mind because you have TFUE, who in the contract, I believe it says he's a resident of Florida. Mm-hmm. In his lawsuit, he's between Florida and California. You've got FaZe, which is incorporated in Delaware, doing business in California. And then you've got New York governing law, which is like, where did that come from if neither party is in New York and none of the services are being performed in New York? So there is a provision saying that New York law governs and that any lawsuits have to be brought in New York.
Right.
Those provisions, like I said on Twitter when I tweeted about this, those provisions you can fight about because typically this isn't universally so because every state has sort of different laws about this. Where services are performed as a contractor or as an employee is where the law that will govern the dispute. Mm-hmm. So if I go and TFUE says this in his contract, he says, I signed this contract in California. Sorry, he says it in his lawsuit. I signed this contract in California. He performed a lot of the services in California. Okay. People dropping bowling balls upstairs. Yeah, there are kids running around like crazy. Anyway, he's trying to say everything is happening in California.
Yeah.
And really, when it comes down to it, they might say, all right, where were you streaming all the time? Where were you performing these services? And he's like, well, I was streaming from, my mom's house in Florida.
Right.
And they're like, well, Florida law applies. Like, we're not even going to apply any of this law.
Right.
So I think they were using that, what's called a venue choice or a choice of venue, choice of law provision to get into New York, but I think they were mainly doing that to get into friendlier territory, like we talked about earlier. Their CEO is a former DA from New York, so he's probably more familiar with New York law. Plus, it's not California where there's some potentially unfavorable law for them.
Mm-hmm. Oh, update: TFUE's lawyer issued a lengthy statement to the Hollywood Reporter. FaZe Clan's lawsuit in New York is a ridiculous and obvious attempt to avoid the consequences of clear violations of California law. Filing the lawsuit,
like I said,
yeah, you called this. Filing the lawsuit in New York is actually an admission that FaZe Clan has no defense to these violations in California law. Ask yourself why.
That's nice.
He's like, Ryan's like, oh yeah. Ask yourself, why is FaZe Clan afraid to litigate its wrongful conduct in California? The answer is obvious. FaZe Clan will lose. In the New York lawsuit, FaZe Clan actually admits to violating California's Talent Agencies Act by procuring employment without a license. Equally egregious is the fact that FaZe Clan is suing Turner under its illegal contract for the monies it publicly represented that it was not collecting.
Yeah.
This is the first
This
time
is
in the
great.
history of esports that an organization has had the audacity to try and enforce contractual provisions that are so clearly illegal against one of its gamers. Jesus.
Yeah, that's litigator moves right there.
Yeah. Get wrecked. That's it. That's pretty insane. That's a Brian Friedman quote, I'm guessing.
I'm guessing.
Yeah,
I mean,
he's
if you
like
click on it, maybe
he's like one of the best.
Yeah, my guess is that TFUE's lawyers will ask the Southern District of New York to stay proceedings pending the outcome of the California lawsuit. And like I said on like my little Twitter stream about this, there's an abstention. This is really nerdy legal stuff, but there's a Buford abstention where a federal court will hold off on ruling on an issue if there's a prior filed state court action that could resolve the issue. And so they're going to say, hey, look, Southern District of New York Federal Court, there's already a prior pending state court action on this stuff. They should just bring all this as counterclaims and then ask to transfer, like to better venue or something like that. So they're going to try to just get it all into California.
Is it really called a boofer?
It's Buford or Buford. I'm not actually sure how it's pronounced, but it's Buford.
I'm going to call it a boofer.
Okay, isn't that like from the Brett Kavanaugh hearings?
In my legal expertise, it's a boofer.
So here you go. I'm going to put the
shit.
specific link in chat.
Mm-hmm.
Is it Buffered? Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention enough then.
Sleeping in class.
I just read this stuff, right?
Yeah.
No, it's like you read a fantasy book. You read like a fantasy novel, and you like come up with your own pronunciations for the characters, and then, like the author's saying, and you're like, that's not how it's said.
Yeah.
The author's like, yeah. So anyway, there you go. If you really want to get nerdy, you can read up on Wikipedia on abstention doctrines.
Is that actually a thing that the New York court will honor? Like, hey, there's already something going on in California. Like, can you guys chill?
It's going to depend on how, like, it gets argued. So it's going to depend on the briefs that come in and whether or not the court is concerned. I will tell you that a lot of courts are like, hey, if somebody else could deal with this and I don't have to think about this for a while, go right ahead. Be my guest.
Is that because they're so busy that they just can't be the CBA? Like, they can't.
Well, I mean, they'll do that within reason. They'll do that within reason.
Because courts are really busy,
right? They won't do that flippantly. They are really busy, and especially if there's some clear-cut authority for it, where it's like, no, this case needs to go forward. They'll be like, all right, yeah. Like courts, especially federal courts, are very good at thinking through all of the issues that they need to, and making good decisions.
Mm-hmm.
But you never know until you see the briefing and until you hear like if there's oral argument on it, and you can kind of get a sense of which way the court is leaning.
So I don't understand in terms of like time. Like,
I was right. Buford. Yeah,
Buford.
Angry Sensei.
You did it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of time, the California one was issued first. The New York one is now
filed first.
Filed first. Excuse me. Yeah. Terminology is very important among lawyers. Yeah. So like when I said that I practice law, and Ryan's like, no, you don't. I was like, okay. Yeah. Okay. So like the one was filed first in California, and then filed in New York. Doesn't necessarily mean, like, I don't understand, like there's some like Doramu, like Doctor Strange level, like time manipulation going on here, right? Where it's like, which one gets answered first? I know it's just like when the court gets to it, right?
So there are certain things that will push them along. Like, this is really getting into the weeds, but federal courts have a report twice a year to show all the motions that have been pending for more than 6 months. And a lot of courts like to have that clean.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll try to work those things out.
Got it.
But state courts, it's kind of, you can schedule things with state courts. So you can file a motion and then schedule it for a hearing. And what I would expect to happen with the Southern District of New York is for TFUE's lawyers to go and file a motion asking the court to stay proceedings pending the outcome of the California lawsuit. And I would expect that to happen very, very soon.
Got it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. And then you said it's basically up to New York to decide how that gets argued and if they want to do it. But they might be willing to push it aside because they're like, okay, sure, we've got enough stuff to do. California can worry about this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what will happen is somebody else will then the other side, FaZe's lawyers, will file a reply brief, and then depending on the local rules, TFUE may file the final brief. So usually whoever files the motion has an initial brief, the other side gets a response, and then the person who originally filed it can potentially get a reply brief. You can get farther than that, but that's usually where it stops. After that, the court will take it under consideration and will either ask for oral arguments on it, like to have a hearing, especially if it wants evidence to be read into the record, or it will just take it under advisement and then eventually issue a ruling. And when that ruling comes out, is anybody's guess is as good as mine. Like, it can take a long time. Sometimes it can be very quick.
Is it actually true filing the lawsuit in New York is actually an admission that FaZe Clan has no defense to these violations in California? Is that actually?
Well, I mean, like, FaZe Clan isn't going to say that. Like, I mean, I see what he's arguing, and I see why he says that.
Yeah.
I don't actually think it is. Like,
yeah,
he can go make legal arguments about it, but like, it's making legal arguments and it's advocating for his client.
Yep. So he's doing his job basically.
Yep.
Yeah. While sounding like super badass, like heavy metal music.
That was a great statement.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
it was super cool. I felt you through the phone call getting pumped when I was reading that. You're just like, oh yeah.
I want to start using like video game terms to describe certain things in law. So like, that's like a crush counter right there.
Yeah.
Like, right? Like, he's coming back like crush counter, interrupt your combo breaker, something to describe these things. Yeah.
That's great.
So
yeah, it's good, man. Like, I mean, I think TFUE like got a really good lawyer. I think Brian Friedman is like a serious player, you know, and he's not foreign to these sort of like public disputes either. Like, he's been in some big stuff.
Yeah.
Let him get back to his family. Yeah, you're right. I should.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
Thanks, Seb. Watching out.
Yeah, Seb Steph covering the bases for Ryan. Ryan, seriously, man, I'm really grateful that you got to come on and you wanted to do this.
Hey, ton of fun, man. I appreciate it. Let's do this again sometime too.
Yeah. Hey, how can people hear about you? Like what do we do?
Fair Play Esports is my Twitter handle. That's where I do most of the public outreach stuff. I don't do, and the other thing actually is on there, the pinned tweet as well. I would really love it to get out to more people. Is a talk that David Graham and I gave at CEO this year about the legal basics that players should be thinking about.
Okay.
And it's one of the most comprehensive things I've heard in the space. Yeah, Google me. That's like, yeah.
That's a good answer.
Yeah. But if more people could get that out, like, I really think it would be a good free resource for a lot of players to have a general understanding of what's going on. So yeah, those are the main things. Otherwise, shoot me an email. I'm on Discord at Fairplay Esports number 7130. I think Fairplay Esports, each one is capitalized, which is why you couldn't find it the first time I told you.
Yeah, plus like Discord has this like really weird transaction system with like adding friends where it's like if you have certain permissions disabled, which I have to have, right, because people add me like crazy. It's like they send you weird. My favorite thing about Discord is like the messages they send. It's like a samurai has been hired to slay people who. And I'm like, what does this mean? Like it's like this like random Discord just sends you these random error messages that doesn't make any sense. So that's like what I got. It was like Ryan or
no.
Yeah, like Ryan has hired a samurai, like, and I'm like, no, he hasn't. I'm pretty sure that's not what he did. Like, yeah, so we made it work, dude. We got here, and honestly, like, I think a lot of people got a lot out of the show, and that'll be echoed even more on YouTube. So, dude, thank you so much for taking the time. And like, look, man, if there's any way, like I said, I will. I'm more like, to use a gamer term, I'm more like a passive buff for you. So like, occasionally when somebody just sort of rolls into my court, I'll throw them your way.
Awesome, man.
And that'll just be kind of like a trickle effect for a while. But I really do want to take the time to honor you because I really feel like you are doing something good for esports and you're trying to push this forward. And I know like this is probably something that you really don't even need to do because you've got like all this big litigation stuff going. But so the fact that you want to do this and like take this on, that you're interested in these problems, we need more people like you in this world.
Thanks, man. Wow. That was, can I just have you walk around telling that to people? Because that was great.
I'm a motivational speaker. It's like, yeah, that's kind of my thing. But really, dude, like, what you add is like, keep doing this, and I'm glad you exist. Thank you.
Thanks, man.
And
Helps a lot.
Yeah, totally, dude. And thanks for coming on. We'll catch up later,
Yeah.
I'm sure, and like just DM or whatever. Now I've got your Discord, so I live there. Just message me about whatever.
Sounds good, man.
All right, my man.